Hello, my name is Jack Henderson. I'm a student at the University of Wisconsin studying aerospace engineering. Along with me is Thomas DeGuire, Nick Garstka, and Nick Karen. To start things off, I'd like to talk a little bit about autonomous vehicles. Nowadays, pretty much everyone has heard about a self-driving car, from Google's own version to Tesla with autopilot. But 15 years ago, this was non-existent. However, planes have been able to fly themselves for a long time. What happens when a plane is left without a pilot? On August 14th, 2005, we find out the truth to that very grim question. Helios Airways Flight 522 was scheduled to fly from Cyprus to Prague with a layover in Athens, but sadly never reached its destination. Just 5 minutes after takeoff at 12,000 feet, the cabin depressurizes and renders the pilots unconscious. At 3 hours after takeoff, the plane crashes in Greece, which means that the plane remained airborne for nearly 3 hours without a pilot. Today, our team takes a deeper look at the events of this disaster, the ethical considerations, and attempt to answer who is at fault for this tragic accident. I now hand off to Nick Garstka, who will take a deep dive into the tragedy that is Helios Airways Flight 522.
Hey Jack, thanks for that introduction. I'll be continuing to talk about the flight of events that happened on Helios Flight 522 that day. So we'll start off at the beginning of the story. The night before the takeoff, the chief engineer at Helios, it's a pretty small company, so the chief engineer can check out the plane. And the past night, the crew had problems with the rear service door sealing properly. So the engineer chooses to pressurize the airplane manually. To do this, he has to flick something, and this just means he doesn't need the engine on to pressurize the airplane. He doesn't notice any real problems, fixes up anything that might be an issue, but then he forgets to switch the pressurization from manual back to automatic for the next day. So that next day, the plane is loading up. There are 121 people aboard, 115 of which are passengers, 6 are crew. They're flying from Larnaca, Cyprus to Athens, and they'll end up in Prague later that day. So the plane is beginning for takeoff. They have 3 separate times that they'll check the pressurization system. However, all 3 times they will fail to notice any issues, which is very surprising because the 2 pilots have 20,000 hours of experienced flight time together, 10,000 of which are on Boeing 737s, which this flight is on. So the plane takes off, no issues so far. However, at 12,000 feet, just to give you an idea, 35,000 feet is cruising altitude, usually for commercial flights. At 12,000 feet, the airplane pressurization alarm goes off. Unfortunately, the pressurization alarm on the 737 is the same sound alarm as one of the alarms that will go off if your pre-flight configuration is wrong. So the pilots have never heard this pressurization alarm before. They assume it's the other alarm, and they disregard it, and they continue flying up. A few minutes later, more alarms turn on in the plane, and the passenger oxygen bags drop. However, the pilots are unaware of the passenger oxygen bags because, one, the cockpit is now locked because this is a few years after 9/11, so that's for safety reasons. And the pilots don't have oxygen bags that drop automatically because that might inhibit their flying abilities. So the pilots don't realize this. However, they do have a few alarms now going off in their cockpit. So they call their ground control where they talk to the engineer that worked on the plane earlier that night. So they're talking together, the engineer and the pilots. And the engineer asks them if the pressurization system is on auto or manual. However, unfortunately, at this point, the pilots have had hypoxia set in, which is the lack of oxygen in the bloodstream. So the pilots are pretty lightheaded. They don't know what's going on. So they disregard the engineer's question and ask one of their own. And then they hang up, and that is the last communication with the flight. It's now assumed that the pilots pass out not too long after that. The autopilot takes over and flies the plane to Athens, where it'll hold it around 34,000 feet up in the sky at cruising altitude. And then the autopilot will hold the plane there for around an hour, just circling Athens because the autopilot cannot land the plane. So it's waiting for input from the pilots. Eventually, because the people in Athens cannot get contact with the plane, they send F-16 jets to go make visual contact with the pilots. And they get up there and they see that the pilots are passed out. They do see that eventually a flight attendant has broken into the locked cockpit and is going to try to somehow fly this plane. However, at this time, the left engine flames out and runs out of fuel. And not too long after, the right engine also runs out of fuel. So the plane, eventually with all its passengers now passed out from lack of oxygen, crashes into a hillside in Greece, and there are no survivors. Of course, after the plane crashes, there's an investigation as to who is responsible. It turns out that the 737 has had its AC system checked 7 times in the past 10 weeks, indicating there were already problems with the pressure system. So the Helios bank account is frozen by Greece, and Helios ceases operation as a company. There were charges against Boeing officials as well as Helios officials. The charges against Boeing were dropped. However, Boeing did make changes to the 737, changing its alarm. Instead of being identical sounds, there are different sounds, and now there are cockpit lights for both of the alarms that the identical alarm was for earlier. However, the 4 people charged at Helios, their CEO, their chief flight operator, their chief pilot, and the chief engineer who worked on the plane were all charged with manslaughter and were given 10 years in prison. However, the engineer successfully appealed this because he says that he did not set the pressurization system to manual and leave it there. He said that he's turned it back to automatic, and that is where the case lies right now. I will now turn the presentation over to Thomas so he can talk about ethics.
So there are 4 key ethical cases to consider over the course of this accident. The first being that of the ground engineer who did the checks prior to the airplane taking off. So kind of the key charges leveled against him is that he acted negligently and was not valuing the lives and safety of the passengers and the crew by leaving the switch in manual after his checks and not flipping it back to auto. Now, the engineer claims that he did in fact flip it back to auto, and ultimately, while he was initially charged in court, he won an appeal and was found not guilty. Thus, kind of based on this evidence, we believe that he did in fact act ethically and carried out his duties with due diligence. However, if he's in fact lying, not only does this present a second ethical issue of lying to a court and shifting the blame to other people, but it also means that he was negligent and did not properly value the lives of the crew and the passengers. The second key ethical issue is that of the crew, specifically the pilot and co-pilot. Again, the charges kind of leveled against these 2 individuals was that they did not act with due diligence and were negligent in carrying out their duties and not properly protecting the lives of the passengers who entrusted them for a safe flight. Now, kind of what factors into this case is that if the switch was left in manual, there were 3 separate checklists that were completed prior to taking off that should have ensured that they caught this error. Given this did not occur, it does seem like the pilots were not diligent in their behaviors and were not properly valuing the lives of their customers by taking the time to go through the checklist properly. In addition, even during the flight, an alarm went off that should have alerted them to the fact that there was a problem. Now, they misinterpreted the alarm, which could be understood as they were not maintaining proper standards and were not aware of what the alarm actually meant. If this is true, which it seems like it might be, we also believe this is another unethical action by not maintaining proper standards of their knowledge of the systems they are working with, which would help ensure the safety of the passengers and themselves. Thus, we do believe the pilot and the co-pilot acted unethically by not valuing the lives of their customers properly. The third ethical case to consider in this accident is that of the Helios upper management. Now, 3 individuals that were upper management at Helios ended up being charged with manslaughter in a Greek court, and the primary charge leveled against them was that they were negligent in maintaining proper standards for an airplane flying company. Now, given that the crew on 3 separate occasions missed the issue in their checklists and also did not properly recognize the warning signs, it does seem quite possible that they were not enforcing stringent standards and maintaining their crew to properly fulfill their duties, and thus we do believe they acted unethically and could have run the company in such a fashion that this accident was avoided. The fourth and final ethical issue to discuss is that of Boeing itself. Now, as Mick mentioned earlier, Boeing ended up changing this alarm after the accident, and in fact, they did know about this alarm issue prior to the accident occurring. Therefore, it seems that given that Boeing knew about this issue previously, it's quite possible they could have taken steps to fix it before any accident occurred, instead of waiting until after an accident occurred. However, this could have cost them either money or reputation with the airlines, that they would have to stop flying the airplanes to fix this issue. Thus, Boeing must have made some sort of decision that it was worth risking an accident as opposed to trying to take steps to fix this issue. Therefore, because they did not fix this issue prior to the accident occurring, we do believe that they acted unethically by not valuing people's lives properly. I'd like to now pass it off to Nick Karen to discuss the risk analysis in this accident.
So I'll be discussing the risks and potential consequences if the groups involved in the accident did not change their ethical practices. To tackle this question, I will be looking at two different aspects affected by the group's ethical choices. This includes the financial impact and the social impact. What would the risks of Helios continuing their unethical behavior be? So Helios here consists of the ground engineer, the flight crew, and the upper management. One thing these three groups have in common, as you might have picked up, is their negligence and their lack of care. These ethical behaviors are unacceptable. If this behavior was adopted by every Helios employee, every flight would be at risk. If any controls had been altered or touched since the last flight, it could result in another accident. The cost of an accident like this is massive to the airline at fault. The cost of lawsuits usually takes up the majority, but can vary greatly on the size of the flight. Right now though, I'm going to show you how much crashing a plane alone can hurt an airline. So the Boeing 737 has maximum capacity of about 125 people, and the airlines make about an average of $15 per person. To make enough money back to buy another Boeing 737, Helios Airlines would have to fly the entire population of Milwaukee to California and back 10 times. Also, socially, this led to a lot of skepticism of flying, especially Helios. Accidents like this will always give the airline a bad name. For Helios Airways, the accident could have easily been avoided, saving them 121 lives, millions of dollars, and their name, if more rigorous standards were just enforced. What would the risk of Boeing continuing their unethical behavior be? The other group in question for their ethical mistakes is Boeing. Although Helios employees acted careless, it does not mean that Boeing is without fault. As Thomas mentioned, Boeing had one single alarm that could go off for two separate problems and sound exactly the same. They were most likely putting their faith in the flight crew to know the reason in which each alarm would go off. Considering how rare it is to have a pressurization issue, Boeing probably thought that this was a calculated risk and took their opportunity to save just a little bit of money. However, the pressurization alarm eventually did go off, and when it did, it was mistaken for that other issue. This ended up causing confusion in the cockpit, and the alarm was eventually ignored. Boeing's unethical alarm had just produced the exact opposite reaction that it was supposed to produce and contributed in the accident. These two similar sounding alarms were sources of complaints from many pilots and gave Boeing a look that was cheap and lazy. Boeing should have known better than to try and save that little bit of money on an alarm for a potentially fatal hazard and stayed safe with two separate alarms, or at least a method to distinguish the two. This would have been a very easy change that was definitely necessary.
To summarize, both Boeing and the crew of Helios Airlines were negligent. Since Boeing was not directly involved with the crash, they were not charged. I consider two alarms, however, one severe and one being less so, sharing the same noise, to be grossly negligent. The crew of Helios Airlines, including the chief engineer, were found guilty and sentenced to time in prison. This concludes our presentation. Below me is a list of references. Thank you for watching, and I'd like to open up the floor to any questions.